is. Okay.
Good day and welcome everyone. We'll get started in 2 minutes. So if you want to freshen up your tea, coffee, whatever beverage or snacks that you have for the day, you have a couple minutes to do that. Good day, it's top of the hour and we like to start on time so we can end on time and have enough time for our panelists to answer all your questions. Good day, my name is Shemaine Tucker and I'm serving as the moderator for this panel. And the panel is Boost Your Middle Management Knowledge, Need to Knows and Employee Emotional Intelligence and Happiness. Our panelists are Lisa Martin and Dr. Michele Villagran, and I will let them introduce themselves.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Shemaine. Our session today will discuss results from a study we conducted in summer 2020 to measure respondents' happiness and emotional intelligence. Yes, we conducted it in summer 2020. We will discuss quantitative and qualitative results, as well as provide time to explore the implications of the data for library leadership with a focus on middle managers. So let's start with land acknowledgements. And I will go first and then turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Villagran. The UC San Diego community holds great respect for the land and the original people of the area where our campus is located. The university is built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship. Lisa Martin, that's me. I both live and work on that unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. I recognize the contributions and presence of members of the nation who are my friends, colleagues, and partners within the community. We also want to encourage you to post in chat the land you stand on, offer introductions, and if you have any land sovereignty links or anything related to the Indigenous rights movement, you're also very welcome to post those in chat. So I'll turn it over at this point.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everyone. The San Jose State University community recognizes that the present-day Muwekma Ohlone tribe is comprised of all of the known surviving American Indian lineages aboriginal to the San Francisco Bay region, who trace their ancestry through the Mission Santa Clara, San Jose, and Dolores. I reside in Los Angeles, acknowledging my territory where I reside, the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers and caregivers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands, and pay respect to the ancestors, elders, and our relatives, relations past, present, and emerging. So who we are. I am Dr. Villagran, Michele. My background with emotional intelligence briefly, Lisa and I have presented together, also done some research together, and we'll continue our journey working with emotional intelligence and happiness. On the job, I am a faculty member, LIS faculty at San Jose State University within the School of Information, where my focus is around cultural diversity. Everything I do, whether it's research, writing, including emotional intelligence, ties into my daily work, even in my curriculum in which I teach. Lisa?
So I'm Lisa Martin, and as mentioned by Michele, I've been researching in this area for some time, maybe about 5 years in total. And at my last institution, I created or co-created an emotional intelligence community of practice. So taking that research and theory and putting it into practice in the workplace. And I've written a few articles and presented, as mentioned. And for me, I see emotional intelligence, as I think Michele does as well, as a way to increase inclusivity in the workplace and potentially a tool then in the long term to increase our equity and diversity. So I think we're motivated by very much by diversity, equity, and inclusion ideals to research emotional intelligence and also more recently happiness.
So as you see, we're primarily going to be using chat, but later on there will be an opportunity to use Padlet. We wanted to really frame this session around some community guidelines, just to foster and create this respectful environment with which we're all coming to today. And this includes actively listening, and even when you're reading messages, taking a stand back. Don't make any assumptions about participants, whether it's identities, past or present experiences, their opinions. Honor one another and respect one another, whether it's through the use of the chat or the Padlet. Really focus on learning about and from one another, as well as from the presenters today. And any actions and information you do share, ensuring it's productive and that we can all take it in. We are all responsible for ensuring a useful, respectful, and productive session. So we encourage you to keep these community guidelines in mind as we move through today's session. So I'm going to begin just covering our research study. The focus or the title, Academic Librarians, Use of Emotional Intelligence and Happiness. So first, let me frame it and tell you a little bit about the context of our research study. So we conducted a mixed methods study, which included demographics, qualitative and quantitative aspects, to really focus on the understanding of the interrelations between emotional intelligence and happiness, through really exploring what academic librarians are doing and their thoughts around both of these topics. Our hypotheses going into this was that academic librarians who rate themselves as more competent, so higher, more competent in emotional intelligence dimensions, will also rate themselves highly in satisfaction with life, which is the happiness scale with which we used. Next slide. So within our study, I mentioned the components about the qualitative, quantitative, but we first started with a detailed literature review around emotional intelligence, happiness, and then both of them, and looking at also the specific literature around libraries, which Lisa will get to shortly. And we utilized two instruments. So we utilized for happiness, the satisfaction with life scale. And then for emotional intelligence, we utilize the short profile of emotional competence. It's a shorter profile of the full profile of emotional competence. We had 3 open-ended questions, and then we, of course, collected demographic data as well. The participants that were invited were academic librarians throughout the world who worked in an academic library, and they were all invited to participate. So I just wanted to share if you can go back one slide, Lisa. Thank you. the questions that really guided our research. I gave you the overarching, what we were looking at, and the hypotheses, but these were our 4 questions related to overall what we wanted to look at and what really was guiding our research. So first of all, what is the overall level of satisfaction of life? So that's the happiness of participating academic librarians. Secondly, the overall level of emotional intelligence skills and competencies of those participating. And then the viewpoints. What viewpoints do academic librarians have related to emotional intelligence practices in the workplace? And viewpoints around happiness in their workplaces. So these are our 4 guiding questions. Now I'll turn it over to Lisa to discuss the literature.
Sure. So we wanted to provide a little bit on the background on emotional intelligence and happiness, and then we'll discuss emotional intelligence and happiness in libraries. And that way, we hope that everyone will have a common foundation and set of definitions that you know what we were working from. So let's start with emotional intelligence. It's a concept which has existed for years in academia, but it really achieved popularity in broader culture through Daniel Goleman's 1995 book. And academic discussions have actually shifted from seeing emotional intelligence as a social intelligence or a multiple intelligence, if you're familiar with Gardner's theories, to emotional intelligence being perceived as knowledge, abilities, and traits. And this is important because if you think of it as an intelligence, that's somewhat perceived as innate or set. But if you think of it as partially composed of knowledge and abilities, those are areas which you can grow in and strengthen. So academic discussions have really moved from seeing emotional intelligence as something fixed to something which we can grow. Our definition of emotional intelligence, for the purposes of this discussion today and sort of how we were conceiving of it as we put together the survey, we saw emotional intelligence as having 4 areas of competence. That's self-awareness, self-regulation, awareness of others, and what we're calling, for the purposes of parallel language, regulation of others. And we really also want to bring up the affective revolution, which is something which really has had a significant role on how we reevaluate emotions in the workplace. So the theory of the affective revolution is that, at least in more Western workplaces, emotions have actually been more accepted and are recognized as something which someone might bring to work. And some of y'all are saying, not at my workplace. This is definitely something which varies, but broadly speaking, we are seeing more acceptance. I should note, we have citations for all of these, and we have our references at the end. Happy to discuss more and share. And the last thing I'll mention about emotional intelligence, so we're using, as Michele mentioned, the SPEC, that short profile of emotional competence. Besides the benefit of it being short, one reason we chose it is because it does focus on distinguishing between the various EI competencies, that self-awareness, awareness of others, et cetera, in order to better direct future growth. So in other words, if you took the SPEC today, the results it gives you would tell you where you want to focus to grow in particular areas. And that's something, again, we're really excited to see in the library profession. So the research and literature on happiness. Happiness is a pretty complex subject, and it has roots in ancient philosophical and religious traditions. We've been asking what makes each other happy and probably also sad since we gained consciousness. But for the purposes of today's discussion, we're using some definitions and some theories that come out of positive psychology. Positive psychology has some detractors, shall we say, and happy to engage with that either through Q&A or chat. But we did pick something which we thought was less culturally mediated and more based on solid research. So let's go into the definition of happiness that we're using. And we can characterize happiness as three things, three different aspects. The first is a momentary emotion of pleasure, what's called in the literature hedonia. And this is what most people think of when they think of the concept of happiness. But there's also a long-term feeling of meaning, or eudaimonia, which sometimes gets left out of people's conceptualization. And the third concept is the absence of negative emotions. So if you just received, heaven forbid, a cancer diagnosis, but you also got out of that diagnosis, out of that hospital, and you managed to talk your way out of a parking ticket, you might be momentarily happy that you avoided the ticket, but some definitions of happiness would say you're not happy because of that diagnosis weighing on your mind. So it's important to think of all three aspects because, again, we typically think of the first one. So as you might imagine, there are many different scales that exist to measure the various aspects. As mentioned, we use the satisfaction with life scale, which besides being short, is also one that looks at some self-reporting by the respondent of global or overall satisfaction with life. So we wanted to try to capture all three aspects, particularly since we did ask people to take this survey during a pandemic. So the last thing I want to cover here is the research and literature on libraries and these two topics. So emotional intelligence is covered in that library research and library literature, but there are gaps. The first thing to know is that, unsurprisingly, there's a focus on academic librarians, in no small part because academic librarians frequently are the folks who have incentives from their jobs to publish. But what's maybe less happy is that there's also a focus on library leadership to the exclusion of library workers, at least in the early literature. So we find articles and books on library directors, library leadership, library directors and their senior management teams, library hiring, handling change, and disaster response teams, including senior library leadership. None of this is bad, but it does open an opportunity and a space to discuss what emotional intelligence looks like in everyday library workers. The literature on librarians and happiness is scant, and it's best characterized by its inverse, unhappiness. There are many, many articles focused on library worker incivility, burnout, low morale, and the burdens of emotional and affective labor. As you might imagine, we do cite our keynote from Monday, Katrina Davis Kendrick, and many others in these articles that we found. It's also notable that we only found thus far 2 articles related to libraries and happiness and internal happiness. And both of those were written by people who I believe would consider themselves to be white and male. So there's definitely some gaps, and there's already some implications if you just look at the literature about happiness in libraries. But we wanted to look at the intersection of emotional intelligence and happiness. So for that, I'll turn it back over. Oh, before I do that, I forgot we had this. So before we go into the data, we wanted to ask y'all to sort of reflect on this question. And you can put your reflection into chat, you can put it into Q&A if something sparks off of it, or you can just sit here and think with it and reflect on it as we bring the data next. So I'll read out the question. What implications do you think employee levels of emotional intelligence and happiness have on their managers and supervisors? So I'll leave this on the screen for a second because I know some folks need a moment to think. And Michele, could you post it in the chat actually? Thank you. I just realized chat and screen sharing don't always agree with each other. Okay. We hope that you keep thinking on this question as we start talking about the data, but let's go ahead and do that.
So let me give you just a little bit around the demographics. So we had 169 respondents. Of those, 129 completed the full survey, which is great because it was, all the questions were optional. This first chart here we're sharing relates to the type of academic institution. The overwhelming majority, 86% of respondents, were from general academic libraries with no special emphasis. A little over 4%, I think it was 4.4, 4.5, identified as medical or health sciences, and a little over 4% also identified in the other category. You can click it one more time. There's another chart here.
Okay.
This chart emphasizes library special emphasis. And I thought this was important to note just so you can see demographically those that responded, how the splits came about. So again here, no emphasis, which I mentioned. I will state that 72% of respondents came from institutions with at least 5,000 students. 48% from an institution with at least 10,000 students. And nearly all of our respondents, 98%, were located within the United States, with the majority from the South. And those with over 20 years of experience formed a slight majority, so about 28%, but overall years of experience was spread about equally across. Next slide. So I wanted to spend a few more minutes to talk about job areas, because this, I think, and I know there's a lot here on this slide, but this question alone came back with so much data. We had a lot of different options that participants could choose for job areas, and you could select more than one. Total, we had 675 total selections of all of these different categories. Respondents perform a wide variety of job duties or job areas, as you can see here. Largest instructional came up as one of the largest, as well as the reference category, but majority were in some form of public service roles. Next slide, or next graph. Now with this graph, I wanted to pull out from the job areas specifically, since we're talking about management or administrative, I wanted to pull out the two job areas that really focus on these. So you can see from our respondents that we had a little over 7% identified within their job areas related to a management component, whether it was as a department head, maybe program coordinator, or other aspect. And then almost 5.5% identified at the administrative level. So dean, director, HR, one of those categories. So we had a lot of folks from our survey that did identify with either management or administrative job area roles. And then I'll turn it to Lisa to talk about the preliminary quantitative results.
Yes, thank you. So as a reminder, we talked about demographics, or in the survey, we asked people to fill out demographics and then two different instruments, one on emotional intelligence, one on happiness. And then finally, we asked them to look and respond to open-ended questions. We didn't require any of this, so people could respond to all four, some mix of them, even none of them. So our number of respondents does vary per area. But we do have some preliminary quantitative results, and I definitely mean preliminary. So we have, as Michele mentioned, looked at type of respondent, what kind of job role they had. and we classified them into employee, middle manager, or administrator. Those were self-selected job titles. And when we went back and we categorized people into the 3 areas, we did make sure that we put each respondent into one category. So we recognize that if you are at, say, a community college, you often wear many hats. But since this is partially about power dynamics, we ultimately picked the hat which had the most power. So you were only categorized once if you took this survey, and you were categorized at the highest rank of whatever job you selected. So in terms of emotional intelligence, the data here is really interesting. And I think that we'll probably go back and do some reanalysis because if you look at sort of a typical respondent in any industry, they would typically score themselves a 3.33 out of 5. And again, this is emotional intelligence and it's a self-select. In our survey, employees, or people who categorize themselves as employees, scored a mean score of 3.19. Middle managers gave themselves a mean score of 3.18, and administrators gave themselves a mean score of 3.22. But if you were to walk up to the average library employee and ask them how they would rank their administrators on emotional intelligence and vice versa, I don't know that these scores would cluster so tightly together. So we definitely want to go back and do some reanalysis here. And again, we do note that none of these scores hit the typical mean, which is very interesting, and potentially some deeper data analysis should be performed on this. Now, in terms of happiness, we're definitely seeing some immediate, very obvious and somewhat disturbing results. So we took happiness, we crossed it by type of respondent, and again, similar types of respondents, though a different N number of total respondents. And if you took the satisfaction with life scale in any industry, we would expect to see a mean score between 4 and 5 out of 7. So in ours, we did see that people meeting that mean score, but we see a huge range here. The employee mean score was 4.74. The middle manager mean jumps very significantly to 5.23. And then the administrator jumps a little more to 5.29. So what does it mean when we see right away that employees are rating themselves fairly significantly lower? And I say fairly significantly because we haven't done the full statistical analysis yet. What does it mean for libraries that we see this big gap between self-reported employee happiness and self-reported middle manager and administrator happiness? So keep in mind, quantitative questions are not necessarily designed to answer why. So I'm going to turn that over to Michele to talk about the qualitative.
And I want to say too, remember, this was taken during the pandemic. So that may also have impacted the scores. But it's interesting that middle manager and administrators are higher on happiness even during a pandemic. Anyway, I digress. Okay, so qualitative questions. These were the 3 qualitative questions we included. And we wanted to include qualitative so we can get rich data beyond just the 2 instruments and really give respondents the opportunity to express and share with us further information that would be valuable for this research and for all of you in the community. So our first question was around definitions. Even though we did provide a definition for emotional intelligence and happiness based upon the tools we were using, we wanted to ask respondents, how would they define emotional intelligence and happiness in the workplace? And then secondly, the last 2 questions here actually were specific. One was around describing a time, so a situation in which you thought you were exhibiting high emotional intelligence. and multi-part really here, because we wanted to also know, well, what was the impact then on your own happiness and the impact on others? And the second one as well related to emotions. So describing a time when, and I might have these flipped here. No, I don't. A time when you're considered yourself happy and how your emotions were impacted. Because as Lisa expressed earlier, and even looking at the literature, emotions certainly are a huge aspect of this and tie into psychology and cognitive aspects. So these were the three qualitative questions. Now let me talk about some of the preliminary qualitative results. So we are currently coding. We started in vivo and now we're moving to deduce, just for purposes to collaborate better together. And I pulled out here only some of the themes relevant to specifically middle managers or even management as a whole. The bubble with a word cloud on the left is overall, you can see the terms or words that were coded already, and you can see some of them jumping out. I mean, emotions is clearly one. Of course, we had intelligence and happiness, but understanding, person, time, positive, able, that came up quite a bit, student, and then just the other terms here. But the three themes I wanted to talk about today for purposes of this session are managing of self, or managing of emotion, your self emotions, managing of others, and then the support received from management or administration. Now the next slide, and I'll prompt you, Lisa, to go to the next when I let you know. We have several statements here. I thought it would be helpful to pull out specific statements from respondents that responded to the survey. So this relates to the definitional questions. And here's just a few examples. One in which the first one where an individual defined emotional intelligence, saying it's valuable at work from clear communications, management, problem solving, and then understanding behaviors, both mine and others. As well as another respondent related to happiness and their definition. Satisfaction with your job. So again, tying into the satisfaction aspect, getting along with coworkers, but feeling supported by management and successfully completing job duties. So here we see how management even comes up within the definitions as academic librarians define both of these terms. The next example. You might have to click twice. There we go. This one relates to supported by management or administration. And I bolded here to really highlight where these key phrases or terms came up. So in the first response, an individual said that in the past, some of the happiest moments have been when administration approved a project or understood a problem. And then further on says about, yes, my happiness regarding these, had an impact on others who were involved in the situation. And then secondly, a differing respondent mentioned that support from administration, creativity and professionalism by all, but support by administration was an aspect that came up for them when they're thinking about, well, is this something that, how am I feeling about my emotional intelligence or happiness? And when I am supported by administration or have that support from my leaders, then I am feeling happy and higher emotional intelligence, therefore. Next one. This one's managing self or managing emotions. And there probably this could be dissected even further as we continue coding. But managing emotions came up quite a bit as a factor or a term, as a theme. And in the first statement, you can see this really is about care and about managing your emotions for positive and productive means, but also being empathetic, which empathy ties into emotional intelligence. And recognizing people bring their whole selves to work. So again, care and trust. And then the second one, this was really specific to emotional intelligence too, the managing of your own emotions, because oftentimes when we come to the workplace, it starts with us. We all bring our unique characteristics, our unique experiences, our unique backgrounds, we bring our whole selves into the workplace. So we're bringing all of that with us, and we have to be aware and able to manage our own emotions. Can't necessarily control others' emotions, but as long as you can manage and are aware of your own emotions and the extent to which that then impacts others within the workplace. And in this example, empathy is also mentioned, as well as I feel most job satisfaction when my EI is recognized and validated. And I bet this person probably would have added with the support of, or having the support of management or administration. There's one last one. So this one I included here because there was also the theme, I would say, around managing not necessarily yourself or others, but also resources. And this is a great example in which the respondent mentioned both management and managing of a team, as well as managing resources. And I think sometimes when we think of management, we immediately think of people, but there are projects, there are tasks, there are resources. There are a lot of things that we manage that aren't necessarily people. So in this case, it's related to technical services when managing a team of staff and even managing these projects and working with changing procedures and software for managing the resources. And this individual expressed that it made me feel like my work was meaningful and showing appreciation for the staff by whether taking them out to lunch, recognizing them with a gift card, or nominating them for rewards or awards. And I think that might be the last example. I wanted to provide all those. We're continuing with our coding. That's just preliminary, but each of those I think do really show some of the respondents beyond the survey and what they are thinking and feeling and have experience from management as well as administration. So now we are going to do a participatory discussion or exercise. We have, we'll continue to use the chat and Q&A, but we have a Padlet with which we are going to ask if you would be willing to take part in. It is anonymous, it's voluntary. If you can go to the next slide. Thank you. Just a reminder again, community guidelines. So I'm not going to read them through, but remember the fostering respect, also being aware of and refraining from making assumptions and focusing on learning and learning from one another and learning with each other, I would say as well, to make this productive session and the productive use of Padlet and chat. So thank you for partaking in this thus far. Let's go to the next slide and we'll put the Padlet link in the chat. Is it Melanie? Can add that in the chat for us. Thank you, Melanie. So keeping in mind the guidelines, if you'll partake in this exercise for us, and this is the question we're asking. The question is, what might be effective strategies for organizational change in your own workplace, given the results we've provided here today? So take a moment to go to the Padlet. You can also share in the chat if you're comfortable. The Padlet, however, you just click on the plus sign at the bottom. You can add it in there. It's anonymous. You can like, I think you can upvote. You can comment on some that have already been posted.
And there's definitely been great engagement in the chat. And as Michelle mentioned, please feel free to continue to do so. We just wanted to also provide an option for anonymous responses if you wanted to. And I'll switch over to the Padlet on the screen in just a moment, but I wanted to give everyone a chance to look at the question and the guidelines before I switched over.
And I will also place the question in the chat. That might be useful. There we go. So take a moment to think about this, and then Lisa, I'll let you go ahead to the Padlet when you have a moment.
Yes, perils of trying to switch screens, y'all. We'll get there.
And Crystal, that's funny. She said, "I'm trying to like some responses and they keep moving." That means that does happen when more comments are added. And this Padlet is open, so feel free to save the link. I don't intend on deleting it or removing it anytime soon. So there's opportunity for those that might listen to this later, this recording, to contribute to it. And feel free to go back to it and continue to contribute to it and even download it. I think you can save it or at least take some screenshots so you have those comments.
Yes, and my screen and I are disagreeing slightly with each other. So please keep writing, keep liking when you can find the result you're trying to like. And I'll sit here for a second and disagree with my computer.
And Lisa, do you want me to read some of them or I can share it on my screen?
Feel free to share it on your screen and maybe I'll try to read since balancing it. Here, let me stop sharing for a second.
And there's quite a few. Wow. Okay.
There are, yeah.
So I'll pull it up if you want to read some of them. We'll tag team here.
Okay. Appreciate it.
Okay,
Dual monitors, y'all.
Hopefully you can see it, everyone.
Yes, thank you. So I think one of the first that I see and that I really love is recognizing that the pandemic has changed everything. And that is very true. I think that rings true for a number of us. I see a lot of folks agreeing with it. And staff who have not needed additional support in the past probably do now. Everyone is reacting differently. And that rings really true to my own experience. So I'm really excited and grateful to see that response. And let me just pick out a few more. And there's so many. I don't think I've ever tried a Padlet with this many folks, and it's really exciting. So one person said providing positive reinforcement about emotional intelligence during the performance evaluation process. And I think that absolutely makes sense, in some contexts where that might be an aspect of what someone is being reviewed on, and asking them to consider that. Collegiality can sometimes be used in that way, and there's other terms which make sense. And of course, really being conscious of issues like unconscious bias and bringing forward that awareness about pre-existing issues with diversity, equity, inclusion, and performance reviews. But I think if you can be considerate and aware of those issues while also talking about emotional intelligence, and an annual performance review could be a great moment. And I want to then jump, someone says, rethinking annual performance evaluations, putting less emphasis on annual reviews and instead encouraging and promoting. I'm just as guilty of losing that track of it as everyone else. I'll get back to it in a moment. That's okay. But I really think it's, oh, there it is. Promote ongoing conversations between supervisors and staff. Ensure these conversations are based in empathy and provide EI training for supervisors who maybe aren't as used to this. And I think that's a great idea, that infusing emotional intelligence into the entire organization, not just at the point of an annual review, but throughout the year. And I think also the point that the person's bringing forward about providing training is really important, that there needs to be some foundational work before you launch into some of these conversations.
And Lisa, can I comment on one that keeps popping? I keep following it as it moves. Now where to go? It's the one, someone said space, physical and emotional space to process experience, but also a plan for moving through emotional experiences and taking action or closing it out so emotional experiences aren't open-ended. I think that is huge in the workplace to have that space or even that place where you can go and that time to process, but even to close the loop, because a lot of times, because of these emotional, I don't want to say baggage, but things that might be hanging there, that then might lead to conflict or impact morale and other aspects, as we heard throughout the conference. So I think that one is a huge one.
Absolutely. And I'm really excited. I think there's really a lot of different strategies and a lot of different techniques. And I love to see the comments and the reactions from people, because I do think by bringing so many people together, we have that shared perspective that allows us to get some ideas about how we might, as a profession, take some action. And I hope that y'all are motivated, especially after Monday's keynote, to really think about ways in which we can take action in order to make change within the profession. So, Michele, is there anything else you wanted to comment before we went back?
I think that was it. I think I would just sum it up by saying that, one, we really appreciate you participating in the Padlet. You never know with technology. And a lot of these probably will be captured in our recommendations when we're writing our final journal articles, because they do resonate with some of the things we've been thinking about. And I just appreciate all of you and your comments here. These are fabulous.
Yes.
I'll stop. Do you want me to stop share and hand it over to you?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Okay. Hopefully this window. I'm screen sharing and I can't see my own screen. It's fabulous.
It's starting. It should be coming up in a minute. But people are still contributing to the Padlet. So thank you. Keep going.
Thank you.
Try double clicking to get into the full screen mode.
Yeah, I'm not. Sorry, y'all. I don't know why this is being. I have a window that will not minimize, so that's fun and exciting. But
do you want me to share it, Lisa? Would that be easier?
Yeah, thank you. I don't know why I'm having strange technical difficulties today, y'all.
It's okay. We got each other's backs.
The heart of what we're talking about, right?
Yes. Okay. But let me get in present mode so you all can see a big screen. Is that good?
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay. Thank you. So we want to leave some time for Q&A, but before we do so, we also want to talk about some of the tools that we used and some of the ways in which y'all might use them in your own institutions. So first, a quick caveat that we see these tools as useful on a voluntary, individual basis, maybe in a community of practice or with like-minded peers. And we want to caution you, you might be interested in using these tools on the people who report to you, but we want you to be thinking about the ways in which this is a positive and not toxic experience. So Katrina Davis Kendrick mentioned in her keynote on Monday, doing what you can to model change and lower toxicity. And this is one where we see if you model that you can work towards that positive change. So we've linked, and we can provide the links in the chat, plus we can make our slides available afterwards. But the SPEC and the satisfaction with life scale, that was the EI happiness and EI scale and happiness scale respectively. And we also note that there are many other scales. We use the EI consortium to sort of evaluate some of the emotional intelligence ones. And Dr. Ed Diener, who's a fantastic researcher in the area of happiness, we used his site fairly extensively to look at the happiness instruments. And we are, as Michele mentioned, we're working on an article. So we're happy to share with you what we've got so far. We've got references at the end of this presentation, but we also, we will eventually have a published article. And I should mention that if you're attending ACRL 2021, we will have a pre-recorded session where we look at the data, not from this middle manager perspective, but more broadly, and we'll have a little bit more in-depth data analysis. So if this is something that interests you, several opportunities to pursue it more and chat with us more about it. And again, opportunities for you to use it within your own organization. But we really just want to caution you about replicating toxicity and instead, really using these tools in a positive and ideally inclusive light.
And with that, I think I'll close us out for questions, and then we can share the references and our contact info. So what is your next move when it comes to emotional intelligence and happiness? And we welcome your questions through the Q&A or through the chat. And here are our long list of references.
And that's just the references from this presentation.
Oh, yes, there are many. And as well as our contact information in case you have questions after. We're happy to speak with you.
Yes, and I see a couple of questions in the Q&A, or I see a few questions,
Okay.
and I'm trying to catch up the chat, but I think.
Did you want me to read them, Lisa?
Yeah, feel free. I think that's more accessible.
So the first one I have, and this is a great question, which I don't think we've decided, but I think we can decide right now. Are you going to use the Padlet responses to add on to your research? They're anonymous. I mean, I think we certainly could, especially if it ties into our recommendations and what we've already been thinking, and there's additional components. And I'll certainly give credit to this presentation and all participants. So I think that's a definite possibility, yes. Lisa, you agree?
Yeah, I think we just want to talk through the ethics really quickly and make sure, since we didn't think of it ahead of time. And Melanie is mentioning we have a couple of raised hands as well.
Okay. Let me read these other two questions here.
Yeah.
Was self-reporting of happiness and emotional intelligence more correlated for managers than other workers? Do you have preliminary conclusions about your hypotheses?
Good question. And I would say that we did. So first of all, background, we expect to see emotional intelligence and happiness correlated, period, because the literature does show that the two are correlated, though the causation is debated. And in this case, I don't know that we saw it as more correlated. And I would also say, since we separated managers and administrators, I think we did see some very preliminary thoughts that there's more correlation the higher up the ladder, but I definitely want to go back and look at the data because I don't speak confidently on that.
Here's another one. This is a great conversation in light of the low morale research Katharina has been doing. How do you see those concepts working together to create cultural change in libraries? I think this is huge. It skipped. There it goes. I think this is a significant piece and just one component, I would say, and we could all take action at varying levels depending on if it's within your department, say department level, if you manage staff, even as a staff or employer, there are actions that you can take, but I think it can be incorporated within the broader vision, we'll say, or even missions of your organizations. But I do see them working together, but as one piece within the broader umbrella, I would say. And I don't think they can be separated. None of these concepts can be separated, whether it's the morale, toxic environments, EI, happiness, it's all related. So therefore, it wouldn't be separated out.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say that to some extent, we see the low morale research, we see low morale in where we work. And we we can hope to an extent that emotional intelligence provides some tools and some ways to make change. And I think we really want to be careful. I know there's some questions I saw very briefly in the chat, and sorry, the chat is huge, so we're not caught up. But we saw some questions about, gender, race, ethnicity, being BIPOC and supervising, and that I think we'll get to in a second because we do see a Q&A question about it. I don't think you can ignore that the system has to change more broadly, and emotional intelligence is not intersectional in that way. I think it can be, but I really want to draw out that we need to look at the system, and we need to look at, it is white supremacist, it is based on some problematic foundations. So this is one set of tools to take down a big system. And I really want to draw that line very carefully.
I agree. The other one, and yes, this came up in the chat, but I also see it in the Q&A. Did you collect data on gender and/or race and ethnicity? And if so, are there any interesting or significant results? So we did. I will tell you that majority, and this aligns with what we already know in the profession, of respondents were white, or identified as that particular category, and female. So there wasn't anything, I don't think, significant or outliers or anything that we would really focus in on, which is unfortunate. And I would actually like to pull out all of the stat and data related to those that did not identify with that category, maybe do some correlating. But there wasn't anything significant with either of those demographic categories. However, in the qualitative results, and this of course is still preliminary because we haven't finished, there I think was some comments specific in the open-ended questions related to not so much gender, but on the BIPOC aspect. There's no more in Q&A, but the two hands. Let's go to the two hands so we don't miss you. And I apologize because I didn't have it open. Do we allow them to talk? I don't know how this works. Oh, one hand went away. Kim McPhee, I hope I'm saying your name right. Your hand is up. And your hand is gone now.
And I think we're in webinar mode. So Kim, you might have to put it in chat or Q&A.
Yeah, the allow to talk, ask to unmute does not seem to be working.
Okay. Kim, I allowed you to talk, but you have to unmute if everybody's to hear you. Looks like it just popped up in chat, a mistaken raised hand from a previous presentation.
Oh, no problem.
Everybody's
No problem.
having technical difficulties today.
Yes.
I think we only have a few minutes. Should we scroll through the chat and maybe see if there's questions we missed?
I'm sure we did.
If we missed anything and you do have, feel free to email us anytime and we'd be happy to address your questions. But while the chat is long.
Oh, yes.
Thank you all for sharing related to land acknowledgements and where you reside in the differing lands.
And just thank you for a wonderful conversation in the chat. We haven't necessarily kept a close eye, but as I think popped in a few times, it's been really great to see everyone responding to each other and mentioning tools and resources and cautions and caveats. Just so rich.
I really like this comment from one of you today about, I think it's a symbiotic relationship. Both parties need to have EI and happiness for a relationship to be productive. And I would agree with that. Again, that's where you can't necessarily separate the two. And there are some overlap if you look at what EI entails. I mean, happiness certainly has, we're dealing with emotions and empathy and our feelings.
And I really liked, someone commented, the more emotionally intelligent and happy employees are, the less emotional labor managers and supervisors will have to do. And I think, we talk about emotional labor maybe more in terms of our frontline responsibilities of working with patrons. But I really like the idea of emotional labor and refocusing it on the work that we do within the organization. And I think it's not just managers and supervisors, but since this presentation is focused on that, it's a really important point. And I'm really going to reflect on it after this presentation.
I do see a question here. I think we have time for maybe this can be the last one. Could it be that middle managers and managers have more work to do and or more information about what organization was doing? So more perceived control in a time when so much was out of our control. I think that's a great point because we collected this data during the pandemic. It may have looked different pre, and certainly when the time comes, it may look different post. So that possibly is a contributing factor. We didn't ask about that, and maybe we should have, but maybe that's future research, right? But a great question. So yes, I would say that might be why or an aspect.
Yes, and we did talk about trying to do this research longitudinally, and we haven't necessarily fully committed ourselves, but perhaps trying to do this not in 2021, but in 2022, when cross fingers, the pandemic is more in the rear view mirror. So we're really interested to see what changes have been occurring post pandemic. So no promises, but we're interested.
And I think that wraps it up because we're at the top of the hour. So I know we'll all get
Yes.
kicked out.
Well,
Yes.
thank you to everyone who attended the panel and all the questions and comments and for your research. And it has been very engaging for people to think about the questions that you've posed. And I'm sure lots of change is going to be enacted in many institutions.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.